everybody tells me it's a page turner because at the end of every chapter, they're not sure I'm going to be around next chapter, right? He told all the staff, one by one in the closed door meeting, whenever Brian Smith talks to you, if you don't come to me within half an hour and tell me what he said, you're going to get fired.
Oh.
The trap is thinking that no one can do it as good as I can.
Yeah.
Right? And sure they can do it, but they'll never do it as good as I can. And that's something you have to learn to live with. Just reduce your expectations by 10 or 15%. Everything will work,
All right, Brian. So as an entrepreneur, and having read your book, The Birth of a Brand, I know one of the things that inspired you to become an entrepreneur was listening to Pink Floyd, one of my favorite bands. And I know as you had to drive around Los Angeles and Southern California and up to the Central Coast and even Portland, building your business, you probably had to listen to a lot of music. So if you were an entrepreneur today, what are 3 albums you would want to have in your car? This is kind of a Desert Island Discs question. What are your entrepreneur albums that you'd listen to in the car?
Okay, well, the first one would be Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd, and it didn't turn me into an entrepreneur. I think I always had that urge to do something for myself, and when I heard the words, no one told you when to run, you missed the starting gun, right? You missed the starting gun. That's when I realized, shit, I've been working as an accountant for 10 years and I hated it, and it forced me to sort of take a real quick look at all my friends who were doing what they liked. And
right.
I came up with I got goosebumps when I heard that. And I thought, oh my God, I've been running on the spot for 10 years. So Pink Floyd was instrumental in making me get off my ass. And I'd already quit being an accountant, but I was like a month into doing nothing. And that really kicked me in the ass and told me to get up and do something. And then, a little while later, I was meditating and I thought, I got the goosebumps again. And I went, oh my God, all the big trends are coming out of California. I'm going to go to California and find the next big thing like Levi jeans or waterbeds or surf brands and bring it back to Australia. And that's how I was going to make my fortune. So that would be one album. Yeah. The other one is equally inspirational, and it's also Pink Floyd. It's The Wall. And unfortunately, so many people cottoned onto that, and all they picked up was that we don't need no education, and it became a really low class type following. But the theme of that album, two records, is all about how people build walls around themselves just by them getting beaten down by parents, teachers, everyone in authority, and they end up just so insecure about themselves, and they lose the fact that their real being is spiritual, right? And they think it's all external because that's what people put on them. You're not good enough, you're too this, you're not quick enough, and so you end up in your 40s like feeling pretty worthless. And if you really get to listen to The Wall in its entirety, it's incredibly uplifting, and it finishes with "Break Down the Wall,"
Yeah,
it's operatic, really.
I mean,
it's a total opera, and that's really what I've been speaking on Ugg for years now, and I've actually developed a talk which is about our spirituality and the role that it plays in our lives.
And so is there a third album that you'd have on your list, Brian?
There probably is, but they're the only two that are really notable.
You know what? When I was growing up, I had a friend and we were huge Pink Floyd fans. And whenever Pink Floyd would come on the radio, we'd be playing pool or something in the basement, and he would stop and literally say, "A moment of silence for Pink Floyd. So, I mean, Pink Floyd is the alpha and the omega as far as I'm concerned. So I'm with you. And so, well, we are here with Brian Smith, everybody, on the Sense and Signal podcast. Brian is the founder of Uggs, and everybody has worn an Ugg in their lives by now. And you all owe that wearing those lovely sheepskin boots to Brian. So we owe him a great debt of gratitude for bringing that to the United States. And he has a book where he shares his experience building this brand called Birth of a Brand, which we had a chance to read, Jodah and I did. And we're going to dive into a conversation with Brian about the spirituality of entrepreneurship, because you don't often think about being an entrepreneur and a business person and spirituality. But Brian, I was taken aback multiple times by how you touched on spirituality throughout your journey. So do you want to talk basically a little bit about where that came from?
Yeah, I always was curious about God. When I was 17 or 18, me and my buddies used to drive down to the coast about 100 miles, and we'd sleep in the garage of one of our parents' houses because they wouldn't let us in the main part. And Friday nights, me and this guy Tom used to debate, is there a God? And every Friday we'd switch, yes, there is, no, there isn't, And so we would talk until everybody would start throwing shoes at us to make us shut up. But that curiosity goes way back to early days. And then I've had a few experiences where some presence outside of me made me aware of something, right? The most notable was when I first arrived in LA. I rented a house in Venice, and I didn't know that there were bad areas and good areas, but I should have picked up that there were bars on all the windows in the whole street, And that very first night, I'd moved. I bought a waterbed that was in a sunken bedroom, and it was, I lit a candle and put it up on the wooden shelf, and I had a bottle of wine and, listened to music and went to bed and woke up the next morning and sat up and everything went black, and I realized the house was on fire. And I crawled along. There was about a foot of air on the floor, So I crawled along, and I was trying to get the door handle to open, and it wouldn't open. And I just semi-collapsed and just said, "Oh shit, I'm going to die." And this voice spoke to me, and it wasn't coming through my eardrums, and I wasn't thinking it, right? It was external. And in this really, really calm voice, it just said, "You haven't done enough with your life yet, Brian." And I just freaked. I went, "You're right." And I stood up and I worked my way down the wall, smashing all the glass out of all the windows. And luckily the bedroom was a couple of steps down, so I had more air there. And eventually some guy with a crowbar came and got me out of the house, And so
that's crazy.
That's an extreme example of how I believe there's another presence that's with us all the time. And it usually only comes to us in times of crisis, right? And that doesn't mean a physical crisis like me. It could be an emotional crisis or a, family crisis. But we're also complacent. We don't try and communicate with that inner spirit. And so I've spent my life trying to be aware of goosebumps, because that's my inner spirit telling me through this electrochemical mechanism that hey, you're on the right track, So that's why I've developed a talk, which I'm about to give the first talk in about two weeks on the role of spirituality in entrepreneurship.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. That's cool. And, much of the book, as you're talking about through spirituality, and Dan mentioned about spirituality, you also, you're trying to get a business going. And one of the topics which you sort of touch on, but you don't you sort of go around on. And I'm just wondering, what was that relationship of you trying to find that balance between, or was there a balance between being Brian, this company person, this person making a product, and let's say Brian being a husband or Brian being a dad, because it was this life, and you would bring them up every once in a while. And I think you probably intentionally kind of kept that out of the book, but lot of people find them in a situation of like, oh God, how do I
It's
how do
not
I
either
balance
or.
this?
I mean, once you start to connect with this inner knowledge, it's with you all the time. And so if you can, when you walk in to see a customer, I used to be terrified of sales, but I learned I would walk in, I wouldn't even talk about the product. I would connect one-on-one with whoever I'm going to meet, right? And um, all the barriers start to break down when you attach, approach people on a human level, and then you walk out of there, and then your wife calls and there's something at home. Well, that same spirituality can work in your family business, and when you get back to the office, there's crises. Well, just being calm and in touch with that inner self makes all of those other things seem so peripheral, and they're just items to be solved. Because once you have that strong knowing in your heart that, hey, the real life is me experiencing the world and other people. It's not selling the company. It's not a Jaguar. It's not a huge house. They're all good things to strive for, and I'm not saying they're not. And I had a lot of motivation to build all those things, but as I've got older now, I sold Ugg. I started another big company and sold that, or actually got taken out by the recession. But those things don't matter anymore. It's all about the bottom line is unselfishly loving everybody. And that's not unconditional love. I don't believe in that, but unselfishly loving every other person. That can be the store owner, that can be your wife, that can be the employees, that can be all your customers. And once you greet people on that, getting to know them and getting to understand them, eventually you get to like them. It's really weird how well that works.
So sticking with that line of thinking, you were regularly placed in a position that was uncomfortable. It sounded like, I feel like every chapter had some degree of being in a position, and you kind of said, be damned. At some point in time, you started to embrace this, be damned with it. I'm going to just kind of go. And you start to embrace the fish out of water story. You started to embrace that and kind of accept the I don't know what I'm doing, guys. But you could have failed, and maybe you did fail. I guess the question is, what does failure look like, or what does success look like? What's the balance of those two in this
failure
world?
doesn't exist until the second you give up, right? And in my book, I got close to it many, many times. In fact, when I lost the company with those new investors, I brought 3 guys on to invest with me, and the deal was such that I didn't actually get my stock issued, and they started telling all the customers that I'd sold the business when in my mind I brought 3 new investors in, right? There was a horrific period, and I ended up, I had a huge meditation on that one, and I got goosebumps. And to me, I think I mentioned goosebumps is my inner spirit telling me that, you made a good decision, you're on the right track. Well, those goosebumps were when I decided, I'd realized I'd lost control 100% of the company until I got my stock back. And I just said to the guys, the new investors, look, I don't give a damn if I never own the company. I really want to get a pair of Ugg boots on everybody. And I went back on the road, and that began a period that, I was no longer running the company. I was just a salesman. And by now I'd come to love sales. And I got back, and this was in year 6. And I got back up after being on the road, and Neil handed me a check for $5,000. He said, that's your commissions. And it was the first time in 6 years I'd ever pulled money out of the company. And the next month I got 10 grand, another 10 grand the following month. And then over the next 2 or 3 years, I was traveling all over the country. I put up nearly 1.5 million frequent flyer miles, visiting all my sales. I had 30 sales reps across the country. And I'd fly into one town, and the guy had, the sales rep had to have 10 of his best customers for a 2 or 3 day sales trip. And so I was meeting 10 people a week by 30 sales reps, right? And so that ended up making me a huge amount of money. And when I look back at when I'd lost the company, which technically I could have walked away from and said, screw it, I shouldn't have been so dumb, I've just lost it. By just
Right.
sticking around and having faith that I would get, that turned out to be the best decision of all. And one of the pieces of philosophy in my book is that it says nearly always, but I'm going to say always, your most disappointing disappointments will become your greatest blessings. And I was on stage 3 days ago in Dallas, and I said, put up your hand. And there's nearly 100 people in the audience. Raise your hands if in the last year something happened at the time you thought was a huge disaster, and now you look back and think, thank God that happened. And I promise you, 90% of the people put their hands up. You could probably say the same right now.
No, I put my hand up for sure.
Right.
I mean, it definitely resonates with me. I think we've all had moments in our careers where we've had setbacks that felt like catastrophic and humiliating setbacks too, which I'm sure when you lost control of the Uggs business
that was so humiliating
during that period,
yeah,
it had to feel humiliating. And so there's a spiritual aspect to that, and it also speaks to the larger theme of your book, which I would say is persistence, like this dogged persistence and willing to picking yourself back up. And where does that, because not everyone has that. Some people would have just said, F it, I'm throwing in the towel. What is it about your spirituality that gave you the fortitude to lift yourself back up, brush yourself off, continue marching forward?
Yeah. It wasn't so much spirituality in that example.
Okay.
What kept me going was I thought, God damn it, 1 in 2 Australians own some sort of sheepskin footwear. Why don't Americans understand it? And it must be me. It's not the product.
Wait, hold on, Brian. You're saying that Uggs wasn't an overnight sensation?
Oh, yeah. I took 5 years and I got a great example, but Australians, you're born with sheepskin knowledge. You cannot rip. You can give it the strongest person they will not be able to rip a sheepskin. And when it gets wet, you can wear it. It still insulates when it's wet, so you can have sopping wet Ugg boots on, and your feet will stay at foot temperature. And you can wash it and clean it, and it comes back like new. Well, Americans think, oh, it's so soft, it's so delicate, it's hot, it's prickly, it's sweaty. We have mud and slush where we are. It'll never work in our area. And finally, after about probably 5 or 6 years, I was at a ski show in Las Vegas, and this buyer came by, and I knew she was from New England. She had about 6 sporting goods stores. And, I was thinking I could sell her on my 20-pair stocking plan, right, which was the biggest plan we had. 20 pairs was a huge amount of boots. And anyway, she was talking about, we have mud and slush, we have to have rubber, we need Sorels, and I just flipped. I said, excuse me, ma'am, would you mind taking your shoes and socks off? And she said, well, why? I said, I just want you to try one of these on. She said, well, I don't need to do that. I can see what they look like. And I said, please, just humor me. And anyway, it was trouble getting the socks off, but believe it or not, that was the hardest part. But when she put it on with bare feet, she just goes, oh, my God, these are so comfortable. I could sell it in the after-ski department. And she bought 60 pairs. And I mean, I almost fell over backwards because I didn't conceive anyone could afford that 60 pairs of boots, But that was the turning point. And after that, it was such a shock to me that we had a rule in the company, because I now had all these sales reps. I said, when you walk into a customer's location, never try and sell them Ugg boots until they've tried one on. Do not even mention Uggs until they've tried one on. And that was the whole turning point of the sales efforts.
So, Brian, question on that one. So, let me rephrase what you just said. So, Dan asked about whether was there a spiritual aspect, and you said no. And it sounds like what you're saying, it was because you felt you had an obligation to get a freaking Ugg boot on everybody's, because they're missing out on life right now without having that shoe.
Sort of,
is that correct?
Because what I was answering was, what kept you going, and it was that, hey, it's not the boots product. Everyone in Australia loves them. America's not much different. Why the hell aren't I working? Why isn't it working? And so it was every time I would get down and think I've got to give up, or the business isn't working, I can't get sales, I can't get, that was not the product's problem, it was me. And I had
Right.
Interesting. Yeah. So you're a problem solver.
Yeah.
And do you think that's what an entrepreneur is then? Because is an entrepreneur in spirit a problem solver?
Yeah. An entrepreneur is someone who has an idea and follows it through. And that comes from inside. You can't pick up a dictionary or an encyclopedia and decide what you're going to do with your life. We all have this calling, and it's literally. I will go so far as to say that imagine there's all these spirits up in heaven, right? They've all been made in perfection, right? And they're looking down on earth, going, "Man, I've never experienced hatred. I've never experienced prejudice. I've never experienced. I'm going to go down there, right?" And they select a human, a baby, they think is going to face all that shit, right? Now, that's pretty extreme, but I really believe that our spirits come to us and they're absolutely individual, as much as a fingerprint or an iris or whatever. The personality of every single one of us is different. Not a single, you could give 1 billion people a brand new Apple Mac with all the identical programming in it and say, "Go out, I'll see you in a year." A year later, not one of those Macs would be the same, right? That's how individual we are and our personalities are. And so an entrepreneur is someone who figures out how to escape the fear of a consistent income, consistent, life is easy, not easy, but predictable. And the entrepreneur is the one who takes the unpredictable route and says, "God damn it, I'm going to see if I can make it."
Yeah, there's a lot of risk taking involved in it, right? I mean, you can't be risk adverse to be an entrepreneur.
Usually, yeah.
Because you have to go full on in, which was what you did with Uggs, right? Because you didn't have anything really. Yeah. Actually, you had probably less than anything when you first got started.
Yeah, but the theme of the book, I'm going to hold it up again, right?
Yeah, hold it up as many times as you want.
Okay. The theme of the book is that you can't give birth to adults, right?
Yes.
Every bit starts with conception, right? And then the first act is the birth. So my conception of, oh shit, there's no Ugg boots in America, was just a conception. And then Doug and I bought 6 pairs, and that was the birth of Ugg, buying the samples. And then every business just lies there. Like, we thought we were going to be instant millionaires, and we sold 28 pairs the first year, right?
Now, should we point out to the audience that Doug is Jodah's dad?
Yeah. Still one of my best friends.
Yep.
Still one of my best friends. And we, after that realization, Doug just went and got another job, and I got stuck with getting rid of 480 pairs of boots.
Well, I kind of want to circle back to one of my favorite parts of the book is the fact that you came up with this concept of having people try the Uggs on bare feet, right? Mm-hmm. And it brings out that kind of wow factor for the brand. And so, that worked for Uggs.
Yep.
What should other entrepreneurs, I think other entrepreneurs need to be thinking in the same vein, right?
Totally,
like, what is that wow factor for whatever product or service you're trying to deliver, and how can you get people to sample it? What is that unique?
There's 3 ways of looking at it. You can look at it from having a wow factor, but the wow isn't the same for doesn't turn everybody on the same way.
Right.
The real trick is to find out what's the objection. What's the objection? Like that woman, she knew that Uggs would not work in New England, right? Her objection was that I need rubber. And once I overcame that objection, she totally spun. And she ordered thousands of pairs over the course of the business, So, yeah, it's finding that objection. Now, getting back to the point that I just remembered, okay, we sold 28 pairs that first year. The next year we sold like $5,000 worth, and the next year we sold like 10,000. It was just limping along. You certainly couldn't make a business out of it. And the season was only October, November, December, and then everyone went into summer mode. So there, at the same time, that I was starting Ugg. There was a company in Oregon called Blue Ribbon Shoes, and they were importing these nylon running shoes from Japan. And they were advertising in all the the running magazines all across the country. And they were trying to get into the collegiate athletic departments and the high school the groups. And they were like 5 or 6 years struggling to get into the market, but just dinking along like I was. And eventually, right at about the same time that they changed their name to Nike, the jogging market took off, right? Jogging became a societal shift. And so all these people who are going to get into running go, well, God, what the hell do I buy? You know, what shoes? And they start researching magazines and they say, oh, these Nikes seem to be around a long time. And so Nike got sucked into this vortex of millions of dollars and hundreds of millions, and they went into the billions. But here's the interesting thing. I just read, a few years ago, I read Phil Knight's book called Shoe Dog. He was the founder of Nike. And would you believe that the first 5 years sales of Ugg was greater than the first 5 years sales of Nike?
Oh, really?
That's as bad as I was doing. They were doing worse.
Oh, that's interesting.
But they got over their objection, right? People didn't want Japanese shoes. People didn't want this. But when the jogging market took off and everybody needed a pair of shoes, that objection disappeared, and now they could start to launch the footwear industry. So that I think, Jodah, is getting back to your question about you don't have a wow, you have to get rid of the objection.
Huh.
So, all right. So one of the things about the book that's interesting in your story is that you come to the United States and you source these boots that have already been established in Australia, and I think they were called Uggs, Ugg or something in Australia, and you brought that and you wanted to make it a thing here because it wasn't a thing here and drive that, and so you were it seems like you were building a brand. And perhaps less so, but the product was already made. Is there a difference between those two experiences?
A brand is not your trademark registration, right? A brand is not your logo. A brand is not the product, right? A brand is what people think of you. And I'm going to give you the classic Ugg example. So after that first disastrous year, the beginning, the next, I got 3 years of summer jobs because I had, just had to. So after the first year, I thought, okay, I got to advertise. So I hired 2 models, a guy and a girl, and posed them on the beach at Windansea in La Jolla, and had the perfect hair and the perfect clothing, and the Ugg boots were like this big in the ad, and the sales that next year went to about 7,000 to 10,000, and so another summer job, and then thought, okay, I'm going to get better looking models and more expensive photographer, right? And pose them on the beach again, perfect hair, big boots in the front of the ad. And the sales went to like 20,000, and it should have been way, 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 way more. And so the third summer job I got was on the golf course in San Diego as a greenskeeper. And over that summer, I realized, this is such a tough business. Americans don't get it. I'm just going to get rid of the inventory that I've got left and go out of business. And so, you know how in California, the big first storm hits in October and everybody sort of switches over, oh, it's winter, And I got home from the golf course totally soaked, and there's like 25 messages on the answering machine going, oh, my God, Brian, people in the store all day asking for Ugg boots. We got to come down and get some. And I realized that, man, I can't even go out of business, and, so I called up the factory. I ordered a whole bunch more production and gave out all the product that I had. And so realizing now I'm stuck in this for another year, I thought I'm going to advertise. But this time I was having a beer with one of my surf shop retailers, and I was explaining this problem. He just, shut up, Brian. And he calls out back to these little 12, 13-year-old grommets, that hold, they store their surfboards in the shop. And he said, what do you guys think of Uggs? And every one of them just went, oh, those Uggs, man, they're so fake. Have you seen those ads? Those models, they can't surf. And like instantly I realized I've been sending the wrong message to my target market. And I was embarrassed at how fake they were when they pointed it out, right? And so as an entrepreneur does, you have to, pivot or switch when you hit a wall. You've got to figure out a way around it. I called up a young guy, Pete Townend, who was a former world surf champion, and he was running the Scholastic Surf Association in Orange County. And I said, Pete, you got any young kids who are going to go pro soon? And he gave me Mike Parsons and Ted Robinson. So instead of posing them, I just took my little Canon Sure Shot and we went for a surf at Trestles and Black's Beach in La Jolla. And these walks, they're a mile to get to the water and fantastic surf when you get there. And I just figured that every kid who's reading Surfer magazine would just be dying to walk down that path with Mike Roberts, Mike Parsons and Ted. And I ran those ads in October, November, December in Surfer magazine and Action Sports. And the sales went to 220,000. And that was the validation about, that was when I learned about advertising and marketing. You never sell your product, right? You sell the features or the benefits, and the more emotion you can get into that, whether it's a page ad or a video or whatever, the more you can draw the audience into it, the more successful the ad will be. And so that was a huge turning point for me. And I was able to take that same theme and put it into snowboarding and skiing. And then back east, I had a couple of years of problem because I didn't know where to go, but I found out that all the kids play hockey. And so I got into the hockey market, which is way, way bigger than the surf market. And that's how it became a national brand. But here's the irony. What's the most popular form of internet marketing right now, right? It's influencers.
Yeah.
Guess what I did 50 years ago, 45 years ago? That was pure influencer marketing with Mike and Ted.
The more things change, the more they stay the same, right?
It's weird.
To your point, I thought one of the more interesting parts of your book that's related to this topic is your encounter with Rush Limbaugh, when your company wants to have him become the spokesperson for Uggs. Kind of an odd fit. When I think of Uggs, I kind of think of surfer, hippie, Southern California, not East Coast, bombastic Republican.
When I read that in the book, I was expecting a different outcome. I'll let you explain it, but I was surprised what did happen, honestly.
I hated that idea, but I had new investors in, and their money counted more than my vote at the board meeting, right?
Right.
Because one of the guys was a Rush Limbaugh groupie. He would do anything to go meet Rush Limbaugh. And that contract with Rush was over $1 million for this 3-month season, and he got to go to the taping of a Rush Limbaugh show, so he got his kicks. But I knew that I'd spent years building this casual comfort brand and a lifestyle brand, and it was absolutely not Rush Limbaugh. But being outvoted, I just went, okay, I'm going to make the best of it, and so I went over to New York to talk about the product, and I got him to try a pair on. Oh, no, I don't need to try them on. Yes, you do. No, I don't. And I said, well, we're not advertising if you don't try these on, right? So I just bullshitted him, right? And he eventually, I can't take my socks off. You take your socks off. And
you're probably the only person I know who's tried to beg Rush Limbaugh to take his socks off.
Yeah. And anyway, he eventually did, and he put in my head that exact reaction that everybody does. And then he just really fell in love with it over that. And so the next morning he came on the air and said, hey, folks, because he'd been really big with Snapple. Snapple was a drink that he took, worldwide. Hey, folks, we have a new sponsor coming on tomorrow. It's Ugg boots, and they're out of San Diego, and they're sheepskin boots. 5 minutes later, our phone system in the office shut down, and we never got it working for the entire 3-month season because all of these Rush Limbaugh fans who were certainly not buyers of sheepskin boots, they wanted first to know, are you public? Can we buy stock in you and all that? So that shut us down for a month, and then all we did was people like this grandmother. There's so many stories. That one of them is there was a really hardcore surf shop in just north of Newport. I can't remember. Anyway, the owner told me, he said, yeah, this grandmother came in. She saw Ugg boots up on the big marquee out front, and she came in and she wanted to buy 6 pairs of Ugg boots because she heard Rush Limbaugh on the radio. She had no idea what they were, right? But she had 6 grandchildren. And so she ended up walking out. And so what we did, we absolutely screwed all of our regular customers because we didn't have enough product for them because all Rush's people are buying it, and they were not really lifestyle customers. So the bottom line is our sales didn't increase because of Rush, because we just swapped one set of customers for a totally different set of customers.
And people were resentful towards you about that, right? Like some of your loyal customers were.
Yeah. But it only lasted 1 year, thank God. And then, I was able to change it back.
Yeah, it's a good. I think it's a really great lesson because he wasn't really in your brand, and you document in your book. You talk a lot about how, and you did in this interview so far in this interview as well, like how you built a lot of relationships with a lot of these surf shop owners up and down the coast, and those were kind of like the cornerstone of your brand, and there was an authenticity to the lifestyle that they were selling through Ugg boots.
Yep, every business should absolutely latch onto their first customers and treat them like gods, because they're the ones that will drive the business 5 years later.
But there were moments though where you had to make a choice. The Nordstroms moment, if I remember correctly, where you make a comment, you had to choose Nordstroms over those customers.
Actually, it was the other way around. Because Nordstroms and I had a love-hate affair. 7 years it took me to get an appointment with the buyer at Nordstrom's, because I would go in and Ugg was still small, right? Still a surf shop brand. But they would say, oh, we don't sell those. We sell shoes, right? 7 years in a row. And then finally this season, we were sort of short on supply because our manufacturers had some hiccups. And this young kid from Nordstrom's downtown San Diego, the young trainees are given what's called a discretionary buy, right? He had like $500. And so he called me up one Friday and said, hey, I want to buy $500 worth of Uggs. I'm Nordstrom's downtown. And he came up and picked them up. He called me lunchtime Saturday and said, hey, I want 24 pairs for 3 different stores tonight. Can I have it? And I said, sorry, next week, right? So because my shipments were coming in every Friday. So the next Friday, he picked up his 24 pairs for 3 stores. That's 72 pairs, right? Friday night. Saturday morning, he says, I want 240 pairs for each store by this afternoon. And I said, sorry. So the next week, I gave him his 240 pairs, but that really ate into all the product I had for my loyal customers. And I said, here you go, but you're off the books for the rest of the season. And so they went the next 8 or 9 weeks with no boots, right? So there's a funny side to this story, right? Funny to me. At the next trade show in March, where they buy for the following season, all these suits came down the aisle, which is unusual for a sporting goods show, but I knew that's the Nordstrom's crew, right? And they sort of strutted in, going, hey, we're Nordstrom's, we want to make a big order and everything. And I said, well, where's John? And they said, oh, he got let go, right? And I said, oh, well, shit, he's the one that really opened the doors. And I said, well, he's gone, we want to deal with you now. And I found out that the previous fall, Nordstrom's headquarters in Seattle was seeing these incredible 24-hour sell-throughs of the product, and they got onto the buying managers and said, "What the f- are you doing? You should have been on this years ago, and you've just been blundering it." And so they got rid of that guy because he made them look bad, right?
Huh.
Which is it's a bummer, but that's how sales works, So and Nordstrom ended up being a very big customer.
Yeah. So I'm going to pivot real quick. So another theme I think I picked up on in the book, besides persistence, or maybe they're actually very related, and that is being cash strapped. I feel like every chapter somehow every chapter ended with like, well, not every, a lot of chapters ended with like success. And then the next chapter, that success we had, we were screwed again.
Just never having enough money and always needed to find capital to basically fund the supply chain.
And so, so my question is, I'm curious, like, why can't companies grow or early companies without external capitalization, or is it possible?
Well, it is, but there's real big limits. Back on the book, everybody tells me it's a page turner because at the end of every chapter, they're not sure I'm going to be around next chapter, right? That's why it's a really fast, easy read, right?
It's a cliffhanger.
Yeah.
It's a constant
like a good
TV
show,
Very much so.
And so to answer your question, though, even though I was an accountant, like a CPA, I had no clue about finance because accounting is what happened last year. Here's your profit and loss. Finance is what's coming up. How do I get enough money to do it, right? So I had no clue about that part of it. And, today there's all these support groups, YPO and EO and, Vistage and all these where you can meet with peers and there's somebody can always sort of steer you through that now. But back then, this is pre-internet, right? So I had no access to that stuff. And so my thinking was, okay, we just sold $1 million this year and I'm broke. What's the solution? Okay, I'll sell 2 million next year. Right, so I'd gear up to get but that 2 million meant twice as much money needed for product, and twice as much money needed for the sales force, and twice as much money needed for advertising, and so a year later you'd be at 2 million, and I'm broke. And what's the solution? Shit, 4 million. Here's the statistic: if you try and grow from internal profits and your gross margin is under 25%, you cannot increase your business more than 10% every year, right? That you just have to believe me on that.
Right. Makes sense, I think.
Right, because you don't have enough cash. You've got 10% available cash to grow. And in my business, I had so many potential knockoffs, I couldn't wait around and grow 10%. I had to be the product leader, which meant I was always gambling with money I didn't have. And then hopefully, I could last out through the winter and summers. And many summers I was paying wages on credit cards, in September, August and September, praying for the first sales to take off in September, October. And then I was flush I had so much cash over Christmas. And then I would build new product samples. I'd build a new marketing program. I'd do the trade shows. And then I'd be sort of broke again, but prepared to double. So, cash flow is a critical part of growth for every business if you want to try and, 100% your last year's sales or more. And now there are great programs. The financial markets are starting to recognize that inventory financing, which didn't exist even 5 years ago, but inventory financing is a new moneymaker for a lot of these financial institutions.
And what is that?
I have an example. I have a lady that I've been mentoring for about 7 or 8 years, and we have a lamb leather sash bag, right? And it retails about $180 with lesser versions. And we found a financier who is helping us buy over $1 million worth of product, which he owns, and he deals with the factories and he sources everything. He owns the product and we pay him as we sell it, right? It's radical, but he's making a fortune. We're able to quadruple our sales because before that we had to prepay 50% on the order to India, and then another the balance before they shipped. So we were negative. Let's say we ordered 300,000 worth of product. We were negative 300 before the product arrived. And if there's a glitch in the shipping or whatever, you're screwed. You can't pay off all the loans. So
yeah, after reading your book, I could totally understand why that is. I mean, it seems like because you are constantly negotiating with that guy George in Australia, for the supply, and then of course he double crossed you at some point and started selling to a competitor. But that's a whole nother story. But yeah, I could definitely see why that kind of capital, having access to that inventory capital, would be such a benefit to an entrepreneur.
If you've got a great product, especially products. If you've got an internet service, it's not so critical because there's no cost of sales really. But if you have products that you have to prepay for, it's a suicide mission to try and think you're going to get big.
What did you learn? So a little bit of a pivot here, but we've talked a lot about your founding of Uggs, and yeah, it was of Ugg boots, and such a tremendous journey, right? Beyond all odds, people not having any faith that this was going to succeed, and you stubbornly persisting and overcoming all these obstacles to make it a global brand. What did you learn about leadership through that process? That's kind of one of the focuses of this podcast. What did you learn about what it takes to make a great leader of an organization?
Well, I'm probably the least qualified person to answer that. I
disagree. I got some insights from your book.
I led by example, right? But I didn't select great resumes or anything like that. My first hire was a guy, Tom, who, his resume looked like he was a clone of me. So I thought, oh, great, there's two of us, and he did bring a lot of extra to the party, but I really should have been looking around for someone on the financial side who could understand cash forecasting. I should have had somebody more into the product development side of things. And then eventually, as we got to, 7, 8, 9, 10 million, I should have had a really good COO who could handle all of the operations and the detail work and leave me, my strength was marketing, working with the sales teams, creating new product, visualizing new markets. That was what I was really, really good at. And I should have had people handling all the other stuff.
So, and I think that that reflection and that learning is important too, from a leadership perspective. And what it sounds like you learned is that you should have been building a better team to fill in gaps that you were able to bring to the table within the organization.
And we eventually did, but it was a bumbling growth. Nothing was planned. And, by the time we sold the company, we're doing about 12, 13 million. And, we threw away a couple of $1 million worth of orders because we couldn't get the product. But we had a pretty good team going then. And, I didn't have to worry about the accounting or bill collecting. I was really into forward-looking projects and, how I could keep growing the business.
Yeah. But I was just going to say, I also think one of your gifts is the metaphor. You come up with some really good metaphors for how to tell your story and your organization story. And again, I want to kind of call back what metaphor that we've talked about earlier in this episode, and you talk about in your book, and I just want to expand on it. But the idea of the organizations being like a child, and it's born. It's kind of the metaphor used in The Birth of a Brand, the metaphor that you use as part of your book title. Why is it important for us to think about organizations like a child that's growing developmentally?
Because they're so similar. I mentioned conception, birth, infancy, right? But if you can keep feeding it and changing the diapers long enough, it's gonna, like an infant can't get up and go to college, right?
Right.
Okay, so it has to go through the toddling stage. That's a cool stage because the first true believers are out there talking about your product, and magazines are writing articles about you, and the retailers are starting to get sick of you coming in year after year after year, so they'll try it, and that toddling stage is pretty quick, because you get into the youth stage and that's the best phase, because you got consistent production. Sales and marketing is working, accounting and admin's working, the warehouse and shipping's working, and everything's in sync. And it took us several years to get to that. But you can run a $20, $30 million business in that youth phase. But if it's a fantastic product or a great, great service, you're going to hit the teenage years, and you can remember you wanted to be at every party on a Saturday night, right? As a teenager.
Right.
Well, it's the same in business. You want to be in every major trade show. You want to be in every mass retailer. And before you know it, you can outstrip your capital so fast and crash and burn. And there's so many examples of companies growing too fast. And so, you need the administrators to come and put the controls in and become a mature company. But that cycle, like when I speak from the stage, I speak to, entrepreneurial groups, some like college kids who've never been out in the world, all the way through to seasoned entrepreneurs. And that's the one thing they all come back with, oh my God, I was thinking of giving my business up, but now I realize I'm in the infancy, or I'm in the toddling stage, or now I realize I'm in the youth, and it gives me, I want to really go back and give it a whole other, effort. So it's really, that's where the book's very valuable in helping people understand, just because they're in the toddling phase, they're not failures. So many entrepreneurs give up because they don't see enough action, but they just got to stick with it and get like Nike. Here's another great quote. The quickest way for a tadpole to become a frog is live every day happily as a tadpole. Right? Right? And look at Nike.
Very Zen sentiment.
Year after year, Nike's tadpole, 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 tadpole. Jogging takes off, frog, right? Reebok did the same thing. They floundered for nearly 10 years until aerobics took off. And they went, they were dribbling along for, nearly 10 years. And then that societal shift hit them. So that's how it works.
Yeah, and I really and for me, the whole adult or the sort of life cycle of child, toddler, it gives, like you said, it gives you a perspective that and frames it in a way so that you can kind of go, oh, that's what I'm in right now, and I can totally see how that would totally help someone sort of go, oh, someone's seen this before, and they framed it, and they're also kind of defining it for me. So it's, in a weird way, your book is kind of a nice little comfort blanket too.
It should be,
it's kind of like, oh. Yeah, it has that feeling. But uncomfortably, throughout your experience, you were, and we kind of touched on this earlier, but I want to ask the question in sort of a different way. You were constantly put in a position where you just said you kind of first questioned, I mean, I think jokingly, humbly, about not, am I the leader? And clearly, I think Dan and I, after reading the book, through influence at the very least, you did lead Ugg into a position of being utterly successful. But like you said, you're kind of, because you didn't control the purse strings, you were always in a position of influence more so than being able to put the knife in the board and say, we're doing it this way. You had to leverage that. And there were some times where you were really put out in the position where you lost some significant power. I think it was during something in Ugg America when that transaction happened, or transition, you found yourself. And then I think that's when you found joy in sales again, if I remember correctly. But how, with that where you find yourself in a spot where the situation, but organizations have changed around you, kind of perhaps optically diminishing your influence in one form or another. What kind of lessons? What can someone who also finds himself in that position? How do they handle that? How do they get out of that, or what do they do with that?
One of the guys that came in with some money, and he was a big influence on me, and he said, Brian, you got to stop trying to run all the details and become more of a director, be more of a manager, right? And coincidentally, around the same time, we were doing a big growth spurt, and my favorite job of the year was putting together the brochures, because again, this is pre-internet, right? We didn't have websites, but we had these huge glossy, 16-page catalogs with photo, and then that was my baby, and I'd been doing it since the beginning. And this is probably 15 years into the business, and I was told that I'm not doing that anymore, and that they'd hired a girl in marketing who was going to put together the brochure, right? And I was pissed. And it took a couple of months, but eventually, I was walking down the corridor in the office one day, and she said, "Hey, Brian, here's the catalog for this year." And I took a look at it, and I felt the paper, and it was this beautiful texture, and I looked at the colors, and it was all muted, seasonal colors, and the product just jumped out, and the layout, the descriptions, everything was so much better than I could have done. Right? That to me was the biggest turning point in letting go. And that's what entrepreneurs really, really, really have to figure out. At some point, they're not the best person for every job. Right?
Yeah, I think that's important for a lot of different people within leadership positions and organizations. That particular moment you described in the book really resonated with me. As somebody who's gone up the ranks, and I work in higher education, you get used to being in the weeds and doing all the detail work.
That's right.
But when you get to a certain position, you're not going to be effective there.
Yeah,
your job's not to get into the weeds, and that's for other people to do.
The trap is thinking that no one can do it as good as I can.
Yeah.
Right? And sure, they can do it, but they'll never do it as good as I can. And that's something you have to learn to live with. Just reduce your expectations by 10 or 15%. Everything will work, And I'm being really truthful in this. It's not just a fun thing. You really have to say, okay, they may not do it how I would, but they'll still get it done. And occasionally you'll get surprised, like I did with that marketing brochure. It was way better than I knew I could do. So occasionally you'll be surprised the other way.
That's true. That's true.
So I'm hearing have the grace to know, have the grace to learn to let things go.
Yeah.
Is kind of, yeah.
So what should entrepreneurs be thinking about today? Kind of focusing, shifting the focus to the future. Yeah, it sounds like you're doing some mentoring with folks today and doing some speaking tours. And, what are you telling entrepreneurs that they need to be thinking about in our changing business environment today?
3 things: start, keep going, and keep going.
That seems like it's universal. It's a timeless recommendation.
Starting is where most of them fail.
Right.
You just got to have the balls to take a risk and do it. And keep in mind, you're giving birth to an embryo. It's not going to be, so many people today with the speed of the internet, you have all these influencers are on, and they've got a Ferrari in the background, and they've got stairways up into their mansions, and they got the yacht out in the other photograph.
It's all on green screen.
It's all smoke and mirrors. No business can grow overnight. No business can grow overnight. My partner, she started working for a startup company at the beginning of COVID, and they got a $14 million grant to develop a test for for testing COVID. They never made it to market. They're broke. They're $14 million out of pocket because there was nothing to build on, right? It's impossible to give birth to an adult.
Interesting.
Better put that venture capital money in something that had already had some foundation to it.
Yeah, they could have bought a company that was doing it. Yeah, there was lots of things they could have done, but no, they just wanted to be, in business on, March of 2000 whatever, and there was no substance to build on.
Let me continue on Dan's question. So, all right, so we've got our 3 things, but Are there any lessons in there from your experience that can help people empower them through those three things? Like what keeps them going? What gives them the temerity to
Once they've
pursue?
started, I would say, and this is difficult, they should join an entrepreneur group.
Mm.
Okay. I wanted to join YPO, but I could never afford the fees, right? And looking back, that was probably the stupidest mistake I made, in value estimation.
I'm sorry for the
This Young
audience. What is
Presidents
that?
Organization. Now there are a much better one for entrepreneurs starting out called EO. It's Entrepreneur Organization,
Huh.
a non-profit, and they're fabulous. But their dues are $4,000 or $5,000 to get in, and a lot of entrepreneurs don't have that much money. It,
No.
No.
they're still trying to figure
That's a
out how to
big
pay the
intrigue.
rent next month, right? But that is
Yeah.
an accelerator. But I one of the other great pieces of advice that I got was, the founder of the action sports retailer market, which started the same year I started Ugg. And your dad and I went down to Laguna to sell our first ad, right? Put our first ad in a magazine. Yeah, that's a great memory. Years later, Jeff, one of the owners, I was seeing all these people, talking about going to college to be an entrepreneur, and he just laughed. He said, "Shit, going to college to be an entrepreneur is like practicing to go out on a date." That was one of the most profound pieces of philosophy because you have no idea what's coming, right? And if you did have an idea
Yeah.
what's coming, you probably wouldn't start. Like if I had access to the internet and pulled up business plans, and then did cash flow forecasts and marketing studies and all that, I would have gone, "Oh my God, that's too much work. I'm not even going to do it."
Yeah, that's another important theme from the book too. Is that realization? Like, if I knew what this was going to involve, I might not have ever gotten started. So
Yeah.
sometimes ignorance is a good thing.
Yeah, I think
Bliss.
ignorance is a critical element that every entrepreneur must have.
Yeah. I would say the only difference I would say with this and that in dating is that with dating, you go in as yourself ideally, and if it doesn't work out, there's
Right.
another date. With that, if you have a passion, you've got to stick with it, though, right? You're not, or it's there's something a little different in there, right? Where you
You're
have
right in a
to.
literal sense, but the bottom line is, when you hit a wall with your date, you figure a way to make her like you anyway, right?
That's
Figure a
true.
way
That's
around or
true.
over it.
Did I say I wasn't a millionaire? I am. I'm a millionaire. What was I thinking? Yes. Yeah. That's right. Okay. I want to drop a name, and that name triggered me in the book because I know that I don't know that person personally, but I know that person.
Right.
Chuck.
Oh my God.
What was up with him? I mean, because I've dealt. I know. I love the confrontation. I'm sure you please talk about that where you finally had it. Beautiful moment. And I've encountered those people.
Let's just set the frame for the audience who hasn't read the books. Chuck is a CEO of Ugg, right? At some point, he becomes this executive. He's the one who's also into Rush Limbaugh, right? If I remember correctly.
He was one of them. Yeah.
He doesn't like you. He kind of tries to set you up as like an embezzler and all this stuff, and tries to have tries to basically get you out of the company in his own way.
What's up with Chuck?
It's a really common theme. I never selected Chuck to be in the company. The guy with the money that I was good friends with didn't want to invest with me because he knew that I was, he said, this was his words. "Hey, Brian, if I gave you money, I wouldn't hear from you again until you needed more." Right? And he was right. I was like, once I'm on a tear, I'm going, right? And so he said, "I'll invest, but I'm going to bring this other guy in who he used to be the CEO of this big accounting firm in the hospitality industry, and I thought, oh, well, he's an accountant. That helps, but the guy was a sociopath and incredibly, the word will come to me in a second. And I found out later, bankrupted his accounting firm. He claimed he took it from 11 million to 80 million, but all he did was acquire all these practices, and he paid such ridiculous amounts when they all started talking to each other. They were sure, shit, I didn't get that much from my practice. And the whole thing imploded and it went bankrupt like within 2 years. So that was Chuck's MO. He would rather, and here's a quote I used to my other directors in this directors meeting. I said, why the fuck can't Chuck get in the boat and row with us instead of taking off on a dinghy and firing torpedoes at us, right? Right?
Yeah,
great metaphor.
I love that, yeah.
And he would rather move up the ranks in the company at the detriment to the company, like cause losses, but he was then further up the ladder. That type of person exists. The sociopaths and, God, what's the word?
Machiavellian, psychopaths.
No, narcissist. He was an absolute narcissist. And everything was about him. And, we never had closed door meetings in the company until he arrived. And thank God it was the last year or two of my ownership. And in fact, when I decided to sell, and we can talk about that in a second, how that came about, a big part of my thinking was if Chuck's around another year, he's going to kill the company.
Yeah. What do you think What do you think was happening in those closed door meetings that he was having?
I know. He told all the staff, one by one in the closed door meeting, whenever Brian Smith talks to you, if you don't come to me within half an hour and tell me what he said, you're going to get fired.
Oh,
that's the level of paranoia and narcissism that these people, and believe me, he's just mine, right? Every other company's got him. Not every, but there will be that element comes into every company, and they are dangerous.
And I think from my vantage point, the me being in the corporate world for so long, is that it's really hard for people to believe that there's people like that. They do things like this on that level of intentionality, to that degree that it's like Malthusian. It's like almost on a level of evil. And I think you're suggesting it's pathological.
Evil, yeah.
I mean, yeah, and so they get away with so much because it's just improbable that what it looks like they're doing is what's happening, because it's just
can't believe people have no empathy. That's not, most normal people care about others and what their actions will do to others. These sociopaths don't have that element in their consciousness.
So how do you? All right, so before we leave, Chuck, he fascinated me, and again, I love that moment where you confronted the situation. I mean, that was like in the movie that would have been the horrific collapse, right? Yeah. But cinematic side aside, what's your suggestion in dealing with people like that? Whether you're a leader or you're a coworker, any thoughts on that?
Stand up to them. You can't let them get away with it. And keep, the most important thing is keep your eye on the big picture. Like when he was doing all that stuff, I left the office and went on the road because I was building all the time. And I would call in, and if there were fires, like, the marketing guy said, "Oh, Chuck told me I can't do that." And I said, "Well, here's a way for you to do it, but not let him know." But, so I was still running the company. But it was a lot of work, a lot of extra work didn't need to happen. So the main thing is confront it and don't let them get away with it. And it'll probably come down to a, head-on fight in a board meeting or something like that. And, I did that. And luckily the other board members, I was able to illustrate it so well that he couldn't answer it, and so he finally got removed. But
well, he kind of shot himself in the foot by
Yeah,
accusing you of something at
yeah,
that moment, at least, that you could clearly show this guy is
yeah,
off his rocker.
yeah,
What's he
yeah. There
talking
was no
about? Yeah.
reality. Yeah.
So,
But
so
anyway,
then
he was he you know, for better or worse, was responsible for the other guy putting the money in. So so I
yeah.
got what I needed. It just came with a hell of a price, you know.
So then we get to selling the company, which is kind of probably where you made your fortune. You kind of
Right.
finally achieved, the level of success with Ugg that you needed
Yeah.
in order to sell. So how did that come about, and what was that experience like for you?
Well, we just finished up about 14 million in sales, and for the last season, and the pre-season the trade shows and all the reps going out with the new product made it look like it was going to be a 20 to 25 million dollar season coming up. And I knew that the investors in Chuck and the other guy did not have the money to bankroll. Excuse me, they did not have the money to bankroll that. And so I was in a bit of a dilemma because I knew that if Chuck is in this company in another year, it won't exist because everyone will mutiny. And I happened to be at a trade show in Atlanta in February, a big show called the Super Show. It's an athletic sporting goods show. And there was a guy I saw at the other end of the baggage claim. His name was Doug Otto. And he and I, for 20 years, had sort of swapped paths. I'd be coming out of a surf shop, he'd be going in, and we'd be at trade shows together. And he had started off with a flip-flop, which was pink, yellow, and pink deck, triple decker with a like a thong. And he called his companies Deckers because of that. And then he ended up taking on all these different licenses, a wetsuit brand and lightning bolt. He took that brand, and eventually he took on a brand called Tiva, which was a sandal brand. And then when the outdoor market in the late 80s, early 90s, when the outdoor market took off, he got sucked into that, just like Nike and Reebok had before, right? The outdoor market took off, and they had the perfect sandal, and they took their company public. And so, 3 or 4 years later, I knew that Doug's company had about $25-30 million in the bank. And I knew that we had these orders that I couldn't fill. And I knew that Chuck was so disruptive we wouldn't be around. And I just had this goosebump moment again where I thought, oh my God, it's perfect. His business dies every winter. We die every summer. By putting them together, you got a year-round sales force, year-round warehouse facility, year-round marketing. And it just made so much sense. And I walked up to him and, we high-fived, and I said, Doug, if ever we're going to do it, now's the time. And we had the respective accountants back in California talking to each other that afternoon. And it took about my one rule to Alan, the financial guy. I said, this will work on one condition. Chuck is never allowed to speak to them, right? And Alan went along with that, and Chuck got he went off to Texas, and we ended up putting that sale together after a year, and it worked out really, really great.
And so now where are you at in your life? It's been, because that will happen in the 90s, so you've had about another 20 years of life.
Yeah.
What was post-Uggs for you?
I've done a lot of things. After a few years of just dribbling around, I invented a lightweight concrete that still had structural strength. And I married that up with steel stud framing and created a precast concrete wall business. And that went extremely well because it was a really great breakthrough product, and it was cheaper and faster than traditional construction. And we put up over 100 buildings in 4 years, which is unheard of, for most contractors. But we were just delivering the walls, right? And then in 2009, the recession hit and construction stopped like August the 9th. Like it stopped
Yeah.
worldwide. And my factory was 2 acres under roof and another 2 acres outside for curing panels, and the rent was $59,000 a month. And I'd licensed it off to a contractor, and they just couldn't, meet the weekly and monthly payroll or your expenses, so they just shut it down. So it was a really unfortunate timing for that. That could have been another billion-dollar business easily.
Yeah.
And I've started a few other small ones, but what I get my kicks out of now is I'm on the road speaking.
Yeah.
Like last year, I was in 4 cities in India, Nepal, Egypt, France, London, a whole slew of cities in the US and Canada. And I love, the feeling you have when you finish the book. Well, that's what the audience feels like when they've finished my talk, because it's
Right.
a really good talk and I highlight some really great principles in business. And so that's really what I do now is I speak to entrepreneurial organizations or businesses who, that maybe they're having a national sales meeting and they want to motivate all the sales force, there's 300 or 400. The biggest one I've done is about 2,500 people at the Inc. 5000 conference. I love that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that was a big one. And
Wow. Okay.
and that's really what I love doing now. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm almost finished with a new talk, which is touching on the spirituality of life and business and, home life, etc.
And so if somebody wanted to reach out to you to book you for a speaking engagement, how would they do that?
Sure. The website is briansmithspeaker.com.
And we'll put that in the show notes.
If you could. And then at the bottom of the website is my, even my mobile number's there. So I don't mean being contacted that way, but best through an email. The email address is there as well. And yeah, if you're interested, you're going to win brownie points if you hire me for your company because it's a really, really good talk.
That's awesome. So I have a favor to ask you.
Okay.
So way back in the 1990s, I had my own friend named Chuck.
Okay.
And it was when it was in the 1990s when Ugg was just really becoming super popular. So Chuck always wore his Uggs wherever he went. And including one time after a heavy night of partying, Chuck decided to go swimming in his Uggs and sank like a rock. So I just want to say if you would be willing to do a public service announcement to my friend Chuck not to go swimming in his Uggs.
Yeah. Chuck, bad idea, buddy. But I'm glad you didn't want to take them off. They're that comfortable.